Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video, we are going to be learning about constructors in Java. So in the last video, I explained what methods are. And there I mentioned that there are two kinds of methods. There are setter methods, which I can use to set the values of the instance variables, which are these things. And there are getter methods to get the values of the same instance variables. Now, there is a better way to actually write your setter methods, because a setter method just gets untidy, right? Because if I have my variables, I will have to make a setter method for each variable. I will have to call those methods separately, and this is just too much work. It's a lot more easier to do the same thing, to use the setter methods with one constructor, right? It's basically like one method solution for all of these setter methods. So in this class that I made called the class rocket, I have two variables, color and age. And I have two setter methods to set a color and set the age. And I also have a getter method to get the color. And then now I made an object called obj of the rocket class, which you can use to call these methods and these and the variables as well. Now the funny thing is that you don't actually have to create a constructor. Right now, there is a constructor in this rocket class. You don't see it, but it's there. It's called a default constructor. Java makes this constructor for you. And this constructor would look something like this. Rocket. And so this is an example of a default constructor. This is there in your class, right? Even if I delete this, it's still there. Java made this for you. I can add this if I want, but it's not required. It's already there. Now this default constructor is called every time I make my object. How would you call a method? I would just say obj dot, let's say, get color. Just change this, get color. So this is the way, this is how I call my method. I will have to mention the name of the method. Now this method, let's say this constructor is kind of like a method, is called rocket. I'm basically calling my method over here, right? This is exactly what's happening. Every time you make an object, you're calling the constructor. This is why your constructor is actually giving the same name as the name of your class. So here, when I say rocket obj equals new rocket, it's calling this method. So it goes to this method, it sets the values, because that's what a constructor needs to do. It needs to set values, and it goes back to where the method was called, which is over here. This is a constructor. It's a lot more easier because you won't have to call these variables. So you won't have to call all of these setter methods separately. It's much easier to do it with a constructor. Now, what we're going to do is we're not going to use this default constructor. I mean, it's just setting the default values of the variables. It's not setting it, or it's not giving the values that I want to give. Let's make our own constructor. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the syntax for a constructor. So the syntax is pretty simple. You need to mention public. Why public? Because you need to call a constructor in another class. If you make it private, you can't. And it clearly defeats the whole purpose of a constructor. The next thing you're going to mention is the name of the class, right? Because every time I make an object, I want to be able to call the constructor. This is the whole point of a constructor. So public and then name of the class. And then like a variable, you will have brackets and parentheses, right? So in a default constructor, you would just give it a default values, or Java might give it a default values if you don't make a default constructor. But I can also give it parameters. I can just give it parameters like I would do for a setter method, and then set the values. Right, now I know I've been saying that there's a default constructor, but let's actually see how this constructor looks like in action. Let's make one of these variables public, just so that I can access them in a different class. It is necessary, or it is good if you make them private, but let's just make it public so that I can access this variable in another class. According to my theory, right, according to what I've explained, when I mention rocket, you would call the rocket constructor, which is there, and you would give it the default value. So color would be set to null, age would be set to 0. let's just call this variable color. So let's just say, let's print obj dot color. We're just calling the variable color. Now, when I print this, I get null. I called my variable color and it was set to null. I didn't give it the value null. The default constructor did when I made my object. That's important to understand. Now let's make our own constructor, right? We don't want a default constructor. We want something that we can change and mold. So first thing I'm going to mention is the word public, because I want to be able to access it in a different class. So public, and then you have the name of the class, which is rocket, brackets and parentheses. Now an important thing that you need to understand is that whenever I explicitly make a constructor, this constructor will replace the default constructor. So right now that default constructor that Java made, it's not there. I've replaced it by making a constructor myself. So you don't still see any error, because now what it's doing is that it's calling this constructor and it's setting the values, which I will do right now. So let's say I public rocket. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give it the values. So let's say I say color is equal to red, age is 10. So what should happen? Well, first thing is it's going to see rocket, it's going to go to the class, it's going to go to the constructor called rocket. Okay, it's going to set the color as red and the age as 10. So when I print obj.color, I should get red, which is exactly what I get. I've replaced that default constructor that Java made for me, and I have this constructor now. Okay, that's important to understand. Now we don't have that empty constructor that's setting everything to the default values. I just have this other constructor that's giving it the values I want. Now if I want to change this a little more, make it a little more flexible, well, I can give it parameters. I can just say string colors over here and int ages over here, and I can set color to colors and ages and age to ages, so that I can let the user set the values himself or herself. So this is the same thing that a setter method does. The only difference is that you're not using a setter method, you're using a constructor, which makes it a lot more easier to set the values. But now you see an error. I haven't given it the values. I haven't given it the values that it needs in the constructor, right? Because remember, my constructor that I made is replacing the default constructor. So now it's expecting me to give two values here for this constructor, not a default constructor. So here I just give it the values. Let's say same thing. I'll just say green now and age as 10. So now if I print it, I will get green. Okay, so that's the real basics about how constructors work. When you make your method, you're really just calling the constructor that's there, and even if you didn't make a constructor, it is there. Java made one for you, and you're just setting it the values that you want, or the ones that Java gives, which are the default values. So in the next video, we're going to learn how you can add more constructors, not replace them, just add more constructors. Till then, thank you for watching. Have a great day.